I used to believe that betrayal had to be physical to count. That summer proved how wrong I was. When I agreed to spend July at my Aunt Rebecca's house in Connecticut, I told my boyfriend, Caleb Mercer, that it would be good for us. Distance makes things healthier, I said over the phone, trying to sound confident. Caleb had been buried in work for months, his voice always distracted, his replies shorter than they used to be. We weren't fighting, but we weren't really connecting either. I convinced myself that a few weeks away might reset something between us. The truth was harder to admit. I already felt alone. Damn why cousin Mason Whitaker picked me up from the train station with his usual loud enthusiasm. Mason had always been magnetic, quick with jokes, comfortable in his own skin, the kind of person who filled every room without trying. As we drove through the quiet, tree-lined streets toward his house, he updated me on everyone I barely remembered from childhood summers. And you'll finally meet Adrian, Mason added casually. He's basically family at this point. I didn't know then how much that name would matter to me. Adrian Cole was waiting on the porch when we arrived. He didn't wave like Mason did. He just watched the car pull in, his expression calm, almost analytical. When I stepped out and our eyes met for the first time, something in his gaze lingered a second longer than politeness required. It wasn't bold or flirtatious. It was curious, like he was trying to solve a puzzle. This is Ethan, Mason announced, clapping a hand on my shoulder. I know, Adrian said quietly. You've mentioned him. His voice was steady, low, measured. I felt oddly aware of myself standing there, of how I held my shoulders, of the way I avoided looking too long. Inside, Aunt Rebecca enveloped me in a hug and insisted I'd grown taller. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and fresh laundry, just like it had when we were kids. It should have felt purely nostalgic. Instead, I felt unsettled in a way I couldn't explain. That first night, the four of us sat on the back deck while the sun sank behind the trees. Mason talked endlessly, recounting neighborhood gossip and old high school drama. Caleb texted me once, made it okay, and I replied quickly, yeah. Miss you. He sent a heart emoji. It felt automatic. At some point, Mason went inside to grab drinks, leaving Adrian and me alone under the dim string lights. So, Adrian said, leaning back in his chair, Mason says you're studying literature. I nodded. English major. I like stories. Stories are honest, he replied. People usually aren't. The comment caught me off guard. You think that? I think most people hide what they want, Adrian said, his eyes on mine. It's safer. I laughed softly, but something about the way he said it felt less like a theory and more like a confession. Over the next few days, the pattern formed without either of us naming it. Mason would suggest a movie, and halfway through, he'd fall asleep. Adrian and I would end up whispering commentary to each other in the dark. We'd volunteer to pick up groceries together. We'd stay outside after everyone else went in, talking about everything from childhood insecurities to future fears. Adrian listened in a way Caleb hadn't in months. When I mentioned feeling uncertain about my career path, Adrian didn't brush it off. He asked questions, specific ones. When I admitted that long distance with Caleb felt heavier than I expected, Adrian didn't criticize him. He just said, it's hard to feel close to someone who isn't present. That sentence echoed in me long after the conversation ended. Caleb called most evenings. At first, I stepped away to answer privately. I described the house, Mason's jokes, Aunt Rebecca's cooking. I didn't mention Adrian much. It didn't feel necessary, but as the week progressed, I started letting Caleb's calls go to voicemail if Adrian and I were mid-conversation. I told myself I'd call back later. Sometimes I did. Sometimes I didn't. One night, after Mason teased me about blending in too well, Adrian and I lingered in the kitchen long after the others went upstairs. The only light came from the stove clock. The air felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. Can I ask you something? Adrian said, sure. Are you happy? The question felt too direct, too intimate for someone I'd known less than a week. I opened my mouth to give a safe answer, but none came. I'm fine, I settled on. Adrian tilted his head slightly. That's not what I asked. Silence stretched between us. I could hear my own heartbeat. I don't know, I admitted finally that he stepped closer, not touching, just closing the space enough that I could feel his presence more sharply. You deserve more than fine, Ethan. No one had said something like that to me in a long time. Not Caleb. Not anyone. I have a boyfriend, I said, though it sounded more like a reminder to myself than a warning to him. I know, Adrian replied softly. I'm not asking you to do anything. But the way he held my gaze felt like he was. Footsteps creaked on the stairs, and we stepped apart instinctively. Mason appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he looked from Adrian to me. Everything good? Mason asked. Yeah, Adrian answered easily. Just talking. Mason's eyes lingered on me for a fraction too long before he nodded and went back upstairs. That should have been the moment I pulled back. Instead, it became the moment everything shifted. The next afternoon, Caleb called while Adrian and I were sitting by the lake near Mason's house. My phone vibrated in my hand. I stared at Caleb's name on the screen. You can take it, Adrian said, though his tone was neutral that I declined the call. Why didn't you answer? Adrian asked that I hesitated. I wanted to stay. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just looked at me like he understood something I was only beginning to see. As the sun dipped lower, casting gold across the water, Adrian said quietly, I think you've been lonely for a long time. The words settled into me with uncomfortable accuracy. That I realized then that nothing physical had happened between us. There had been no lines crossed in the obvious way. And yet, sitting there beside him, choosing his company over Caleb's voice, I felt something undeniable. That it wasn't just attraction, that it was alignment. That evening, Caleb left me a voicemail asking if everything was okay. His voice sounded uncertain, almost fragile. I listened to it while lying in bed, Adrian's earlier words replaying in my mind, you deserve more than fine. For the first time since we started dating, I didn't feel anchored to Caleb. I felt suspended between who I had been and who I was becoming, and somewhere in that quiet Connecticut house, without a single touch exchanged, I crossed a line I couldn't uncross. That was the night I stopped being loyal, not with my body, but with my heart. By the second week of July, I had developed a habit of checking my phone only when Adrian Cole wasn't around. That it wasn't a conscious decision at first. It was a preference that hardened into pattern. If Caleb Mercer called while Adrian and I were mid-conversation, I silenced it. If Caleb texted something sweet or routine, I answered hours later with something polite but distant. I told myself I was just busy. The truth was simpler. Adrian made me feel seen in a way that made everything else fade into background noise. Mason Whitaker noticed the shift before I did. That he stopped teasing me about blending in and started watching instead. His laughter came a beat too late when Adrian and I exchanged inside jokes. If I sat beside Adrian on the couch, Mason chose the armchair across from us rather than squeezing in. There was a tension in his posture, something guarded, like he was bracing for impact. One evening, after Aunt Rebecca went to bed early, the three of us ended up outside again. The air was thick with humidity, cicadas buzzing in the trees. Mason excused himself to take a call, leaving Adrian and me alone under the dim porch light. You've been different, Adrian said, studying me carefully. Different how? More honest. I let out a quiet laugh. That's one way to put it. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You don't pretend as much around me. The statement should have felt flattering. Instead, it unsettled me. Pretend about what? About being satisfied, Adrian replied. About being secure. His words landed too accurately. Caleb and I had built something steady, something safe. But safety, I was beginning to realize, could blur into complacency. I'm not unhappy, I said, though the conviction in my voice was thinning. I didn't say you were, Adrian responded. But there's a difference between staying because you're happy and staying because you're afraid to start over. Before I could respond, Mason returned, his expression tight. He looked from Adrian to me and forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The next morning, I overheard raised voices in the kitchen. I hadn't meant to listen, but my name cut through the tension like a blade. You're doing it again, Mason said sharply. Doing what? Adrian's tone was calm, almost bored, getting close to someone who's already attached. There was a long pause. I'm not forcing him into anything, Adrian replied. That's not the point, Mason shot back. You like the chase. You always have. My stomach dropped. I stepped back before they could see me and retreated upstairs, my thoughts spiraling. When Adrian found me later that afternoon by the lake, his demeanor was unchanged. He sat beside me without asking, close enough that our shoulders nearly brushed. Mason worries too much, he said lightly. About what? About me. The answer felt incomplete. Why? Adrian picked up a stone and skipped it across the water. Because he thinks I hurt people. The admission hung between us. Do you? I asked quietly. He turned to face me fully, his expression unreadable. I don't lie about what I want. That's not what I asked. A faint smile touched his lips, but it didn't feel warm. Sometimes people get attached to ideas of me that I never promised. The phrasing unsettled me more than if he had outright denied it. I thought about Caleb's voicemail, about how easily I had started replacing him with someone else in my emotional space. That night, Mason knocked on my bedroom door. He didn't sit, he stayed standing, like he wasn't sure he was welcome. I don't want you getting hurt, he said plainly. Why would I get hurt? Mason ran a hand through his hair. Adrian doesn't do halfway. He gets intense, then he gets bored. I bristled instinctively. You don't know what this is. Mason's jaw tightened. I know him. The implication stung. Are you jealous? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Mason hesitated just long enough to confirm something I hadn't considered. It's complicated, he muttered. Complicated how? The answer came the following evening. That I was looking for a charger in Mason's room when I noticed an old photo half tucked inside a book on his desk. It showed Mason and Adrian sitting shoulder to shoulder on this very porch, closer than casual friends. Their expressions were unguarded, intimate. On the back, in faded ink, were the words, "Last summer was ours." My pulse pounded in my ears. When I confronted Mason, he didn't deny it. We tried, he admitted quietly. It didn't end well. You and Adrian? The words felt foreign in my mouth. He nodded once. He said he didn't want labels. I wanted more. The pieces snapped together with sickening clarity. The tension. The arguments. The warning that I found Adrian outside, as if drawn to confrontation by instinct. He looked up as I approached, reading my expression instantly. You knew, I said, holding the photo out. Adrian didn't flinch. It was last year. You never told me. You never asked. That's not fair. No, he agreed evenly. It's not. Anger flared, but beneath it was something worse, humiliation. Was I just, what? A distraction? Adrian stood slowly, closing the space between us. I like you, Ethan. That's not an answer. His gaze sharpened. Mason and I ended because he wanted something permanent. I don't. The honesty felt brutal. So what did you want from me? I pressed. A pause. Then, I wanted to see if you choose differently than he did. The word struck deeper than I expected. Choose differently how? Stay in something comfortable, Adrian said softly, or risk something uncertain. I realized then that this had never been just about attraction. It was about proving something, to Mason, to himself, maybe even to me. My phone vibrated in my pocket. Caleb's name lit up the screen again. For a moment, all three of us existed in that silence, Mason watching from the porch steps, Adrian standing in front of me, and Caleb calling from miles away. Are you going to answer? Adrian asked. The question carried more weight than the ringtone. That I looked at the photo still clutched in my hand, at the evidence of a past I had walked into blindly. I thought about Caleb's steady patience, about the way I had slowly withdrawn without explanation. For the first time since arriving, clarity cut through the emotional fog. Adrian didn't reach for my phone. He didn't try to stop me. He simply waited, curious to see what I would do, and in that suspended moment, I understood something unsettling. Whatever choice I made next would reveal more about me than about either of them. The phone kept ringing. I inhaled slowly, my thumb hovering over the screen, aware that summer was no longer about escape or discovery, that it was about consequence, and I had finally run out of excuses.